I'm Ranji Khanna. This is the John Hope Franklin Humanities Institute, and it's very nice to have you here. It gives me great pleasure to introduce our visitor today, David Marriott, who comes to us from Emory University. Thanks to all of you for coming, to everyone who has helped to organize this, and to the Schiff family, Dean of the Humanities, who has shared with us part of the Schiff Family Humanities Fund to support short residencies at FHI, thus allowing us to revive a program of in-depth engagement with a single scholar whose work is appealing across a number of different fields. David Marriott is a poet and a philosopher, a number of things. He is the author of various poetry collections: Incognegro, Salt, 2006, Hoodoo Voodoo, Shearsman, 2008, The Blood, Shearsman, 2011, and Duppies, Commune Editions, 2019, Before Whiteness, City Lights, 2022, Blue Town, Omnidawn, 2023, and his chapbooks include In Utah from 2012 and Latif, 1992. I think that's right. Our colleague at Duke and David's former colleague, I think, at UC Santa Cruz, I assume you overlapped, Nate Mackey, wrote of David's first volume of poetry, Marriott's Incognegro, is unerring as a wish returning from the land of the dead. He speaks with stark, unsettling eloquence, a book of astringent water, elegy and lamentation alongside Take No Prisoners, portent, fill these beautifully mournful, beautifully acerbic poems. David's critical work began with an analysis of the poetry of J.H. Prynne, which may, in retrospect, seem surprising, but actually perhaps not, because in that thesis, he focused on, quote, the connection between categories of being and theories of meaning subtended through a discussion of Prynne's use of verbal nouns and derivational concepts, end quote. So ontological questions, as well as processes of signification, also arguably of back formation, derivational syntactical forms like verbal nouns or gerunds that are nonetheless devoid of their verbal function, might inform his later readings of the Fanonian idea of the derivational negative, most famously encapsulated in that phrase, the Negro is not any more than the white man. Le nègre n'est pas plus que le blanc, which is to say that it is perhaps through a notion of poesis or the emergence of something in language that did not pre-exist its linguistic syntax and utterance in enunciation and statement that we might approach his body of scholarship. His critical books include On Black Men, Edinburgh University Press, and Columbia University Press, 2000, Haunted Life, Rutgers University Press from 2007, Whither Fanon, Studies in the Blackness of Being from Stanford University Press, 2018, and Lacan Noir, Lacan and Afro-Pessimism. In press is N'est pas Writing Art and Politics from Stanford, which I understand is coming out in a couple of months. On Black Men ranges over analyses of lynching photography to considerations of Frederick Douglass, apparently the most photographed man of his age, to studies of Richard Wright, Fanon, and other artists of the violation of the Black man. He suggests, quote, existence may be a struggle for us all, but for the Black, his being is the effect of a war fought on at least two fronts. He must enter into combat not only with the presentiments and premonitions of a world condemning him to non-existence, he must also enter the lists against his own image, end quote. Haunted Life, Visual Culture and Black Modernity continues an interest in visual culture and takes us into the manner in which media technologies are haunted by racial slavery, how, quote, spectrality and the visible and what links them is a failed mourning, and, quote, the occult presence of racial slavery nowhere but nevertheless everywhere, a dead time which never arrives and does not stop arriving, as though by arriving it never happened until it happens again, then it never happened. You can see the question of recursive time that is in play here. The book traverses John Edgar Wideman's memoir, The Island, Martinique, René Marin's Un homme pareil aux autres, the psychiatrist Frederick Wortham, the filmmaker artist Isaac Julian, Richard Wright, Stanley Kramer. The visual arts are once again foregrounded, but this time with more attention to the ways in which media technologies and experiments with them trouble being through the foregrounding of non-presence. The momentous Whither Fanon Studies in the Blackness of Being is a major text in what you might call the sixth stage of Fanon studies, one that focuses on the clinical work and reads the rest through that lens. If psychoanalysis has since its inception struggled with the relation of phylogeny to ontogeny, Freud famously didn't publish his paper on the topic, we know that Fanon brought in a term arguably implicit in psychoanalysis, but definitely not foregrounded as Fanon does, sociogeny. The bringing together of the psychiatric and the political demanded a form of thinking, the psychopolitical, and as such forms the basis of an understanding of that, preempting Althusser or Marcuse in the context of Marxism, Irigaray or Mitchell and Rose in the context of feminism, even as sexual difference is perhaps arguably the difference for psychoanalysis writ large. Decolonization and its revolutions, if one can call them by that name, are understood by Marriott in relation to hysterical form. The consistent study of anti-blackness through that work defines something he will call Fanonism. If you have been hearing the foundation of Afro-pessimism, and particular the relation to Wilderson, in fact, Wilderson uses Marriott's title Incognegro for his memoir, Marriott does not exactly accept that Afro-pessimism nomenclature for himself. Fanonism begins, Marriott writes, at the point where both optimism and pessimism become impossible. Some of us have recently been reading the complex Lacan Noir, Lacan and Afro-pessimism, which is in many ways a book about Lacan's theory of the signifier. It addresses well-known parts of Lacan, like the separation and division of the sexes implied in restroom designations, to less known but important seminars, like Seminar 3 on psychoses, and particularly Robinson Crusoe's footprint, the zone of non-being in Fanon, and Frank Wilderson's study of film in Red, White, and Black. Clearly, from what I have described, you will gather a through line of a focus on the word and the syntactical, but more precisely on the signifier as that which gives and subtracts, the subject in formation and dissolution, and of course, a consistent return to Fanon. But also you will have noticed an extraordinary range from Francophone to Anglophone writing, to the visual arts in many media, to media philosophy, and a focus on what is afforded by the ontological and non-ontological turns in philosophy. His own investments in poesis surely evoke this challenge of being he addresses, and I'm very curious to read his forthcoming book that seems to announce a question of the relationship of writing and non-existence. David Marriott has taught at the University of Sussex and at Queen Mary University of London in English departments, at UC Santa Cruz in the History of Consciousness program, at Penn State in Philosophy and African American Studies, and he is currently Charles T. Winship Professor of Philosophy at Emory. The title of his talk today, this is the first of two, is The Crisis of Truth 1. The next one will be The Crisis of Truth 2. We had a little bit of confusion about that, whether they were both 1 and 2 or not. But anyway, now it seems that this one is 1, The Crisis of Truth 1. With that, please join me in welcoming David to Duke, where he will be with us for the next 2 weeks.
Hello, everybody. Thank you, Ranji, for such a gracious introduction. And thanks to you all for making my visit so far such a pleasant and stimulating experience. So, yeah, the title, first of two, is The Crisis of Truth. I won't be, my ambition is not to offer some grand insight into the nature of truth. What I'm going to do instead is kind of offer you a reading of two propositions. So in this lecture, I'm going to deal with one proposition, and in the second lecture, I'm going to deal with another proposition, considering the relationship. I'd like to just begin with these two epigraphs. And the one on the right, you see the Latin and Greek etymologies of the word crisis, and in terms of relationship between, say, judgment and judicium. And the one on the left is perhaps from the better known text by Paul de Man, in which he writes, the rhetoric of crisis states its own truth in the mode of error. It is itself radically blind to the light it emits. So I suppose the first question is, what is this light that emits blindness and error, or that illumines blindness and error? How does one perceive or know it when what it emits is truth and error at once? And to speak crisis, I suppose, is both to know and not to know by a sort of prolepsis or preterition. But why blindness? Because it is impossible to deduce what we know from the shadows cast by our own identifications. The error of that is all the more dangerous because it hides or displays itself as true, and with as much lucidity and sincerity as deceit and delusion may thus pass for truth or a crisis of truth. For those who seek to reveal truth about error, or to reveal what is concealed as error, no one can know beyond a doubt whether what is thereby revealed is true or just further error regarding our own conception of it. I think all of these meanings are encapsulated in this etymological history on the right here. So one word for this conflict, which de Man identifies in a sense of error or of what overcomes error, is crisis. When Paul de Man says that there is no criticism without crisis, he's not saying that criticism is enabled by crisis. It is fundamental to de Man's account that the greatest criticism remains absolutely incapable of self-reflection on its own identifications. Left to itself, criticism ceases to be critical when asked to reflect on those identifications, to which it remains addicted and attached. It is therefore the case that criticism, or you could use the word critique here, crinine, cannot simply be recognized by those who sincerely seek to think it, nor by those who shun it. Thus, no crisis can be conceived without this divide between what we say and what we do not know in the saying of it, in whatever way it, the incomprehensible, say, is communicated to us. So one of the conclusions that I draw from this brief statement by de Man is that crisis is where these kinds of aporia are played out. But I think it would be unwise to say that crisis is simply an aporon of logic or language. Why not? Because the more reality or being crisis has, the more it fails to be thought as crisis. We might say the subject that thinks, that has to think in order to speak of crisis, cannot know or has to ignore the conditions by which crisis cannot be represented as crisis. For crisis is, by definition, unfathomable to those conceptualizations that would seek to designate it. To speak of crisis, we must therefore be aware that this is not the same thing as crisis speaking. The concept of crisis cannot itself be crisis-ridden, for the critical light it throws on blindness must be distinguishable from crisis, and so always beyond crisis. This beyond cannot be gainsaid if the task is to try and think crisis as crisis with respect to the nature and validity of its truth. So what then of crisis's critique? What then of its philosophy if crisis is always transcendent with respect to every discourse and representation of it? I want to end these preliminary remarks by saying I do not care to know what crisis is. What I'm interested in is the prestige that the language of crisis gives to experience. For me, that prestige relies on a language of truthful self-recognition, which prompts the question, what happens to crisis when it goes unrecognized, unseen, overlooked? Does it lose its prestige if we choose not to see it or acknowledge it? Must crisis be seen, i.e. articulated, represented, for us to be able to judge it or witness it? But what happens when we actually see crisis or claim to know it? I mean, crisis is ubiquitous. It's everywhere in the public realm. It seems to carry a lot of ethical and ontological weight. But what good does it do to indulge it rather than, say, resist it or refuse it? Rather than persist with these questions, I think a proof of my concerns will be to offer you a kind of reading, and I'm going to do so by turning towards my first proposition. To explain what this is all about, I'm going to turn to a specific case history. But first, I want to, before turning to that history, I want to give you another quotation, and this is from the British psychoanalyst W.R. Bion, who's a leading theorist of what has become known as object relations. So this is taken from his book, Attention and Interpretation, and he's basically asking the question, what does a lie do to thinking? Can a lie be thought without a thinker? He says the lie requires a thinker to think, but truth or true thought does not require a thinker. He is not, or she is not logically necessary. The only thoughts to which a thinker is absolutely essential are lies, he declares. And again, he seems to be wanting to recast the normal relations between, say, ego, cogito, and ergo sum. So consequently, what matters in analysis, according to Bion, is not the liar's ability to perceive the lie's true meaning, or the analyst's ability to perceive the lie's true meaning, but, quote, the emotional upheaval against which the lie is mobilized, unquote. In brief, we lie not because of what we think we know or do not know, but because of the crisis out of which the lie emerges. We lie because we are required to think. And lying is one of the ways we refuse to do so. For essentially, it denotes a lack. The lie denotes a lack of the capacity to hold onto or contain or negate what is being referred to here as emotional upheaval. In any case, the consequences of upheaval do not rely on logic or semantics, but a part of us that lies also precludes us from understanding it. And since the lie does in turn have a use beyond what we know of it, we are no more capable of reaching its meaning than of embracing its emotional significance. For the lie's consequences are greater than our ability to contain it. Hence, a lie is a lie because we cannot bear what Bion calls the pressure of certain thoughts. A lie, therefore, is a thought that blinds itself as thought. This is why analysis is never simply a case of being able to separate the lie's meaning from the context in which it occurs, including exposure, concealment, confession, but also the aims, feelings, beliefs, and the hopes of the liar, which, if true, would be significant. In fact, that's only half Bion's formula. Only half of the story of what he thinks liars are, in fact, doing. So in this, it's a very important paper, and actually this is a very important book too. What he's trying to do here is link the question of Kant's a priori to the question of unconscious knowledge. And in doing so, he opens up a rift between what he calls an unthought known and a thought that is known to be unthought. To put the question in terms closer to the language of krisis, is the unthought the place where knowledge is blind to its own identifications, to its own pretensions as knowledge, or is it the place where thought and being become fundamentally detached, discrepant? And the reason I ask that question is because Bion goes on to say, in his own words, the lie, he suggests, and this is a quote, is not restricted as the word lie would ordinarily imply to the domain of thought, but has its counterpart in the domain of being. It is possible to be a lie, unquote. So lying, or failing to distinguish truth from lie, thus has onto or psychopolitical implications. And note the phrasing. Lying does not simply arise from judgment or from judicium, but from a way of being. And then he goes on to make, again, a very interesting move. He says the thinker, this is again a direct quote, may express a truth in a lying group, but the group may not want its ideas disturbed. And this is why the relationship between such a group and the thinker will be one of envy and hate, unquote. So I think it's probably already clear what these statements imply, and which is quite blatant. Groups lie to deny the disturbing idea that they are liars. And the idea out of which the group emerges requires it to lie, to resist what is true, to preserve itself as a group. In other words, we as a group never lie as much as when we want to be truly understood, especially when the pleasures of understanding deny or repel a truer thought that bewilders us, for we find it too disturbing to our way of being. So I'm just going to give you one example, a playground example. You can find this anywhere. You are not part of the group. Let's just take that as a ready-made example. Let's call this the formula of apartheid. It does not require an addressee or referent for us to grasp what is meant. A referent is not logically necessary. And yet, would it be wrong to say that this sentence names a true thought? And true because it knows what disturbs it. True because, logically speaking, it doesn't seem to matter whether the you is real or imaginary. There's an analogy here between truth and the performance of a lynch mob. But according to Bion, what is undeniable here is also that this notion, you are not part of the group, also implies implicitly and explicitly the question of lying. And perhaps what is so disturbing about Bion's notion of a true thought is this sense that we can never be sure that it's not a lie, or that we can never know with any analytic certainty that a lie is not at the same time its founding condition. For the delusion that reveals this incapacity also conceals our very capacity for delusion. To illustrate this point, which all of this might seem very abstract to you at the moment. What is he talking about? And I do agree, this is kind of difficult, but I don't write Bion's work, he writes it himself. I'm just trying to interpret it. But I think to illustrate it a bit better, and hopefully things will become more clear in this lecture, I'm going to illustrate it by this specific case history I mentioned as a way of talking about this, what I was mentioning to be this proposition one. And my example here is, because we're studying these texts in Ranj's seminar this week, my first example, in this lecture, my only example, is an essay from 1955 written by Whither Fanon called Conducts of Confession in North Africa. Now, I think Fanon needs no introduction here, so I'll just move quickly on. In this essay, Fanon explores what it means to, quote, discover the truth of the act when the act is revealed to be without a perpetrator and a criminological understanding of it becomes impossible, unquote. So just to give you some background, this essay is about Fanon's experience in the colonial courtrooms in Algeria, where in his work as a psychiatrist and state expert witness, he's been called by the French courts to assess sanity or insanity of Muslim patients. And in those cases, he's drawing attention to what he calls, and again, I'll give you a quote, the particular complexity of the problem of confession, unquote, at a time of total civil war. A war that was also taking place in language itself. So let me, by way of summary, flatly state that an act without a perpetrator is not the same thing as a thought without a thinker. But I am interested in what the two notions are trying to tell us or make known. Namely, a thought or act that does not mean what is meant by either word. And yet, that does seem to imply or suggest a categorical form of commitment or pure imperative that is authoritative, obligatory, exacting, and yet is not something for which the ego cogito can take responsibility for. All of which leads or tends to the same question. What is this as if, and is there some specific way in which it commands group awareness in its utterances and actions? So as Fanon puts it, when we confess to a crime, we seem to be paying back a debt with something other: guilt for innocence, piety for transgression, knowledge for ignorance. More, confession means what we did, are, and what we have become. All equally need to be witnessed together so that they can be judged as true or false. But consider what happens when the act to be confessed is to be revealed without a perpetrator. What is it, or what is it called when a performative utterance seems to depend on a specific case of ignorance and non-knowledge? I'm not thinking of an excuse which would then be opposed to verity, but of a denial that is precipitated by its own impossibility. A denial or lie, which in fact involves a rigid demarcation of two groups along racial, religious lines, and where we see two opposing accounts of obligation and culpability, responsibility and belief. Now, that problem occurs in Fanon's account of Muslim defendants, who he says categorically deny their culpability, but who do not, quote, actively try to prove their innocence, unquote. So we shall return to this word actively, which already seems to imply a profound passivity. Fanon continues, the accused Muslim's refusal to authenticate by confessing his act, the social contract proposed to him, unquote, does not entail an unthought, but its exact opposite. For what the defendant refuses means, and this is again another quote, that is often profound submission to the powers that be cannot be confounded with an acceptance of this power, unquote. Therefore, one's decision, and again I'm quoting, to recognize an act before judges is already to avow that one disproves it, unquote. So Fanon's point, and I really would recommend spend some time with this essay, even though it's only about 4 or 5 pages. Fanon's point, and a great deal follows from this, is that if there is a submission that actively refuses submission, or an avowal that already disproves its avowing, whatever makes one of these statements true cannot itself be grounded in truth or falsity. Neither term is appropriate. So what's so troubling about this? Well, I'm going to give you my 2 cents worth. The difficulty lies in a refusal expressed as a non-willful, non-complicitous submission. Now, this is a collective refusal, something which each defendant is performing, is what makes these refusals add up to a group rather than an individual behavior or identification. For what is exposed is not an egotistical sense of exposure. In each case, the defendant is obligated to refuse, not because these refusals are associated with guilt or reparation, nor because they are associated merely with mental crisis. What I'm actually arguing is that whatever makes these refusals or denials performatives cannot itself be rendered as a crisis of desire or judgment. To illustrate why, I think we need to go a bit deeper into this paper, this 1955 paper. What I'm going to suggest is a kind of contrast between these 2 words, ikrar and levu, both mean confession, but they have radically different implications, consequences in Fanon's reading. So the issue here, let me just state this very simply, is not how particular words with the same meaning can be used to express meaning differently in different languages, but rather the suggestion of a fundamental aberration in their specific uses and performances. We will come back to this. So when Fanon is talking about these acts without a perpetrator, there's a complex question of truth being hidden in these 2 words, which I want to kind of unpack. And because they offer 2 different histories or accounts of what confession is. So beginning with the French word, so the normal account of confession is, as I say, one which offers absolution, say, and forgiveness, and it relies on a trope of revelation and or negation. The performative dimensions of confession require the subject to be able to speak the truth about itself, and so deliver by bearing witness that self from its culpability. As I've tried to already indicate, this is not what Fanon is identifying in these Muslim defendants. Above all, their denials, and the question here is what might be the link between resistance and denial, exposes law, and I would add revelation, to a kind of vertigo where there's no longer a firm ground for the very language of interpretation. So Fanon's question then becomes in the paper, what is this confession without a confessor? Why does it matter so much to this group Muslim identity? And he says, it would be too simple to say that nativist confession is a lie because it is categorically true. And it's too simple to say that it nevertheless speaks the truth in its denial. So I'm going to turn to Igla in a few moments, but I just want to say, already in this paper, Fanon, in his analysis, is referring to how psychoanalysis and also law can often turn unwittingly into collaborative agencies, rather than simply dealing with the question of sanity, insanity, in terms of litigation. And in unpacking that point or problem, he reveals something which a denial, a refusal, what I'm saying is a denial which precedes sincerity and or guilt, in a way which cannot be reduced to what has become known as a differand. Why can it be not be reduced to a differand? Because this isn't an argument about rules or standards. This is about a fantasy of truth, where what is revealed is presumed to be always already known. And again, this might seem an abstract point, but it's a very simple point. And this is how Fanon puts it. Everyone knows, underlines, that the North African is a liar, but he suffers from a propensity to lie, Fanon declares, and that he is unable to make out truth and false due to a phylogenetic weakness. Unquote. So any magistrate, police officer, psychiatrist can testify to this fact using numerous examples and regardless of any evidence to the contrary. Then he writes, but does such a simplification allow us to discover the elusive truth, he asks. So if everyone knows that the North African is a liar, and that is what passes for truth in these French courts, every false statement by these self-same Muslim defendants makes all racist statements true. Just as reciprocally, every obligation to speak the truth is ipso facto proof of a phylogenetic incapacity to speak or know it. How then can we possibly know when a North African is lying? Because he, she does not seek to convince, persuade, atone, negate, nor absolve themselves of being North African. Plus, African lying is not just a question of the accusative or defensive modes of discourse, but specifically indicates an ontic or ontological inability to state the standards of truth in their white imperialist norms. Precisely by way of his judgment or his conclusion, Fanon shows why the accused is right to stand firm and hold their ground. By not giving up on their desire, these North Africans not only dispute racist lie in its truth, but they also reveal how French law bears witness to a categorical truth, but one denied by its own legal traditions and history. So as an aside, this suggests that there are two speech acts that performatively cannot be judged or witnessed here. A confession that cannot name itself or confess itself, and a judgment that for different reasons makes judgment insignificant or contradictory. It can well be imagined that such conditions make the expert uneasy, Fanon tells us. Hence his constant reference to a feeling, and this is an important quotation, of gravitating around a system that ontologically escapes us, unquote. The word system includes law and psychiatry, but also fantasy and knowledge. And all are defined by what encloses and yet evades them. But also note the emphasis here. There's no way of reaching the center of things, for the system itself lacks a center, and precisely because it is centered on an impenetrable absence, which it itself invokes, and where what is set in motion has no more capacity to reach truth than to perform beyond its own metaphysical delusions, which represent the breakdown rather than the transcending of knowledge, truth, or certainty. Accordingly, the word system seems to denote something infinitely remote from any transcendental principle of truth and something that radically decenters or escapes from any claim to absolute truth. Now, at this point, I think I just want to turn briefly to the word éclat. Again, means confession. I borrowed this term from Islamic jurisprudence. So in the essay, although Fanon primarily uses the French word "lever," the reading is aimed at the meaning of what he calls group alienation and a certain interpretation of Muslim culture. On the other hand, his reading also puts into doubt or question a conventional, again, understanding of this word. So let me just go through the conventional meaning of the word igla. If we place the word back into Fanon's argument, it does not, I think it exacerbates the Greek and Latin meanings of confession as, say, ego cogito, or as a scene of moral judgment. Igla does not reveal what is hidden or private, which is then publicly acknowledged and verified. No, Igla makes explicit another formula in which confession expresses a debt, the logic of which is categorical. Or, to put it another way, in Igla, what is said is secondary to what obligates it, which binds us no matter what, and tells us that spiritual debt is part of the recognition of right itself. The reciprocal recognition of Igla, in Igla, of a right or a priori obligation does not tell us what we ought to do to be moral, but it does tell us what we owe if confession is to be deemed valid. One confesses, in brief, not because one wants to be delivered from one's weaknesses so as to enjoy them all the more, but to own up to one's obligations so as to be possessed of them as what is spiritually owed to the other. And precisely because what is owed does not belong to the self or the pleasures it takes in confessing, but to the existence of something altogether more punishing and unmanageable. Or if Igla turns on the admission not of guilt, but of liability, here retraction reveals one's debt to the group as creditor. However, and this is my argument, when Fanon examines confession in this brief, very short paper, something altogether different comes into view. A different pathway for confession emerges, not from inner compunction towards outward contrition, which is the French genealogy, nor debt to piety, which is more like the religious meaning of Igla, but from an act that changes the very meaning of the word, and in which the rights of the group can never be avowed as a right of another against self. Hence, the issue is not simply one of power, but the relationship between what we understand we know and what we must never know to be thus related to the racist life of the group. Again, this is a complicated point I'm trying to get across here, but I think I can say it better. Just to be clear, the issue here is not one of legal definition or evidentiary doubt, nor is it a question of opposing Igla to Lavu, or of deciding, is this confession true? Fanon is not interested in any of those questions. On the contrary, his interest lies in what happens when confession, when it is no longer accountable to the individual or to the group, subject or knowledge, escapes all obligation and responsibility to the racist idea of the group, but also, and I would add more strangely, to the racist fantasy of language itself as performance. And so we ask, I'll give you another citation before we draw this lecture to a conclusion. For the criminal to recognize his act before a judge is to disprove of it by denying, by retracting. Does the North African not refuse this? He asks. not refuse? That is, not refuse, quote, the subjective assent that founds and gives the sanction a meaning, unquote. So one of the questions I've been concerned with is where, from where, or on what authority can such refusal be made? I think if you read Fanon's work, and in particular, the famous chapter on violence, there is no better proof of a crisis of truth in the colony than in this struggle over the evidential and the juridical, over who has the right to judge the true and who has the right to dispute its cognition or performance. And indeed, if by retracting, the accused also withdraws from every relation and dissimulation, that is because their refusal is also what separates them from the very order of the world that obliges them to confide and so confess. So I think what Fanon's paper ends up saying, the Muslim defendant is obliged to confess what as an individual cannot be confessed. And here, unsurprisingly, we return to the lie, or perhaps the lie as a model for the group. The interest of Fanon's text, and again, I have not come across any readings of this, which goes into what I see to be the kind of radical speculative propositions being offered by these texts. The interest of Fanon's text is that it explicitly shows how confession as lie no longer functions performatively or cognitively when the colonial court finds itself, quote, face to face with a defendant who categorically denies having done anything, unquote. Again, the logic he's offering is not simply one of inversion as to when a lie is revealed in its truth, but refers to a world of discourse in which what is being confessed by being denied is detached from any ordinary meaning, and what is conveyed has no addressee or referent. So what I'm actually pointing to is something more like this, which is, again, I could take sentences like this at random from a range of Fanon's texts. So if you understand these sentences, I think what he's basically saying is that there's no shared code or interpretable rule between, say, French judicium and native dictio. A world in which every intention to communicate remains indissociably enigmatic and hateful. In a word, here, every signifier, and go back to the Ranji's introduction, drifts uncertainly, and so has to be contained by law, by force, and also by race. But what sets it in motion escapes. I think what Fanon is referring to here is both inner and outer alienness, even if it can never entirely escape the implacable judgment of racist law. This is why Fanon's account of confession, I'm just going to end in 2 minutes, has nothing to do with what, I think has become known as a différend. The dispute is not, it seems to me, one of rule or judgment. The damage suffered is not the damage done to the heterogeneous, but the damage suffered by the racist ordering of judicium and dictio, or truth and interpretation themselves. So this is not a question of crisis. Indeed, I would argue that here, judgment is called into question, not by crisis, but by what Fanon calls elsewhere a NEPA, which because it is spoken and yet cannot ever be spoken, has no foundation in right or the understanding. Let us say that the blackest speech, and I use that word loosely, cannot be converted into the universality of any maxim, not because it's presumed to have no thought or cogito behind it, but because it can only speak of what it is not. And this is not, does not speak in any language or as language. It precedes both terms, in or as. So I think that's what, I mean, put it very crudely, I think that's what leads him to say that in these acts without perpetrators, these confessions without confessors, there's no I, which can then retrieve or lose its sovereign self-coincidence or its egoic identification, precisely because the Black or the native cannot return to itself as a self-representation. Why? Precisely because native speech, Black speech, is expelled, always already expelled from this tribunal of reason, and that is why it has to be judged in all cases as false, impious, and beyond ethics and justice. As such, it cannot be read as crisis, or at least this has been my argument. Thank you. This work that I'm doing on this piece does relate back to the question of witnessing, prophecy, spiritualization of a way of being, I suppose, if you want to call it a way of being. This is very distracting. Yeah. I suppose when I was thinking about how he was phrasing the encounter with his defendants, I think one thing that is missing from the actual paper is the voices of the defendants themselves. So again, you know, Fanon's in this odd position of being employed by the state, which is radically unable to hear what is being said as anything but a lie. So the obvious thing for him to do would be to say that, yeah, we need to restore truth of the message being said and to restore kind of authentic question of being to these sentences, which are not speech, discourse. But he doesn't do that. And he doesn't say that confession, whether it in its religious or secular sense, can quite get at the status of these denials. At some point, I'm hedging my bets. I sometimes refer to them as refusals, sometimes as denials. One could push back on that uncertainty in the actual presentation itself. But what I'm interested in, I'm going to ask you to come back to me on this, is something which moves us, a way of speaking which moves us beyond thought or knowledge in any ordinary or eventful sense of speaking truth to power or in any of those ways. And being a psychiatrist, I think what Fanon is interested in is not simply what is being said by not being said, which I think is a very ordinary inverse relation, but I think he's interested in what cannot be said in an absolute sense. And maybe at that point, you are talking about something which is ineffable, which will take us back to the more spiritual, religious connotations of Iglar. But I don't know, what do you think?
So those
Yeah.
I mean, I teach religious studies, right?
Yeah.
There's something about, I mean, anyway, just like where my mind was going about how you're using that word.
Yes.
I mean, rightfully so. I think it's something very productive about this productive that you use it, and then also how it sort of the affect that it has, right? In that moment when the Quran is like revealed, and but then also what it does to the hearts of people who recite it.
Yes.
This sort of notion of a spiritual depth, sacred truth that operates above the truth that gets created by human beings.
Yes.
Yeah, that sort of goes, that operates from an originary point, right? So and I'm mentioning that specifically because of, and by the way, this chapter 96. I'm thinking about the way in which the naming of the chapter refers to the plot of blood. It's like originary before history, before politics, before religion, capital R, before reality, blackness, whiteness, all of that. I don't know. I'm just thinking about all those things that are in my head. There's not a like concrete thought there. I'm just pointing out the that are happening.
Yeah, I mean, you raise a whole heap of nuanced questions, further questions, which we could pursue. I mean, maybe people in the room might want to chip in at this point in terms of what you just said. No. I've stunned them into silence. Oof. Yes. Yeah. The mention of the word tyranny. Did you mention the word tyranny? Dictatorship? Okay, I'm going to use those as synonyms. So there's two ways you could respond to this. So there is first the ordinary tyrannies of language, by which, what passes for truth is always a compromise formation, precisely avoids what is in fact the more disturbing truths. And that's, I think, maybe Psychoanalysis 101. So I don't need to elaborate that so much. And, you know, that takes on multiple forms: repression, negation, disavowal, blah, blah, blah. Here, what is truly enigmatic and also difficult to think is something that cannot be said, can't be recognized as being said, because it's denied both a status as a predication and as an identification. So if all North Africans are liars, everything that you say is, in a sense, disqualified from the order of what I'm calling the judicium, going back to the opening epigraph. But then again, Fanon is talking about that. Does that mean then that Fanon is saying that the only person who can recognize a native truth, going back to questions of political, religious community, is the group to which you belong, or which you elect to belong? But that is already contradicted by what he calls the lie which constitutes every group identity. So the tyrannies or the despotisms or the dictatorships are everywhere. There's no place outside of them. So the question then becomes one of not one of compromise, going back to my last quote from The Wretched of the Earth, but from antagonism, structures of antagonism. And again, you know, when I normally read philosophies of performative utterances, the question of antagonism tends to go sidelined. But I think when Fanon's reading, the question of what is a performative in this particular instance cannot dissociate it from antagonism. And again, I don't know, the antagonism I'm trying to talk about is at the level of language itself, not just at the level of identification, it's at the level of language itself. And it's taking place between the histories of these two words, Iglar and the French lavou. And yeah, the more I think about this paper, the less I understand it. Because it takes you up to a place and then just drops you. Because the questions just spiral out. But that's not a problem, but it's very difficult for a Q&A. Sorry, yes. Oh. Yeah. Mm. 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 Mm.
In that moment, you say you're outside of it.
Mm. Yes. Yes. That's right.
Do you lose?
Yes. Yes. So, okay. Again, another great question. Thank you for that. Clarifies my argument for me, which is very useful. So, when if I can just backtrack to that Bion quote, which I began, where he says, a lie in the when we're talking about lying, I'm not talking about it in the ordinary sense. So, you know, one can be a liar, or be a lie, sorry, be a lie. There is a sense in which he himself is already trying to overcome that Kantian distinction between, say, thought and being, or what we represent and what we can absolutely know as such. So your question is forcing me to think about, well, what happens to the question of the political if I try and get to this outside as a transcendental point? I understand that hesitation and I share it. So when I go back to this kind of neither nor kind of argument, I'm trying to have my cake and eat it, insofar as there's a moment, and again, I'm going outside of my lecture, there's a moment in the preface to the Phenomenology of Spirit when Hegel talks about truth. And he says that the normal conception of truth and falsity is that, you know, you arrive at from one to the other, and you dispose of the false when you get to the true. And his metaphor for that is like sloughing off dross from metal. Do you know what I mean? And he says, no, that's not what I mean by a more speculative account of truth. He calls that representational thinking, you know, das vorstellende Denken. It's picture thinking. And I think, or I'm arguing, that kind of thinking, that which puts falsehood and truth as opposites, does not grasp this more speculative dimension of truth. And it doesn't have to be a transcendental proposition, but it does involve a movement from considering them as just opposites. So I suppose what I'm trying to do is avoid reducing this kind of speculative dimension of Fanon's argument to simply a new form of opposition. And again, if I went straight into the politics lying behind this kind of statement, which can easily be reduced to a they and an us, a they versus us, most of my work on Fanon is trying to really go against that kind of simple oppositionalism. But there's another aspect of your question which I haven't yet addressed, and that concerns what happens when you are expelled from the tribunal of reason. Where do you end up? You've asked a difficult question, because I'd have to and also related to that, why I had to move beyond crisis. I think what I'm also claiming, and this again, you can push back on this, is that the very language of crisis, which is everywhere, from climate to economy to subject, that is representational thinking. And it always gets reduced to representational thinking, insofar as, you know, if you do this, we can escape that, blah, blah, blah. And the argument between, say, reason and power here, or let's say politics and science, but I prefer reason and power, is this tussle about who has a final say on what is in fact true. So it's become a deeply political question, that very opposition. But I think crisis itself becomes, this word, empty, vacuous way of talking about truth. I want to hold on to this idea that truth is genuinely disturbing to our ordinary ways of being, and not just simply a property which we add to our various wardrobes of discomfort whenever we feel discomfort, like putting on a new outfit. No, I think there's something, if you can make sense of truth without feeling any discomfort or any challenge, then perhaps something's gone missing, perhaps. again, these arguments are not being put at the level of the truth of propositions. I mean, this is not a genesis validity kind of argument. This is very much trying to look at the, as you say, the ontological or onto-juridical implications of lying and speaking truth. But thank you. I think there's a question at the back. Mm-hmm. Yes.
It doesn't not many people take into account the fact that India is fighting for freedom. So that always resonates my understanding. I'm very in my brain. The context of this. If it isn't actually possible, thought and here as material for language. Maybe beyond even like the data that can't be contained is so then I guess the law period. Two figures for fighting for another that might have given them insight about.
Yeah. Okay. So yeah, we could spend a while talking about beyond, but the one of the things that interests me is his genealogy of thinking itself. So he says thinking is called into being to cope with the pressure of certain thoughts. So it's not we think and then we have thoughts, but no, we have, I mean, it's very strange. We have thoughts which cause thinking into being. And those thoughts as or invariably ones of unbearable anxiety, upheaval, frustration, envy, hatred, all the rest of it. So there is a war going on. I mean, you can call it whatever words, at the foundation of the psyche. What brings it into being, what allows it to be thought, represented as thinking, is a consequence of a kind of violent dissensus within the very note, before the subject even becomes a self or is aware of having a self. So those are what you call the better elements. And he uses this word thought for him. To explain it, he talks about thought needs to be digested or metabolized and turned into what he calls, I mean, again, just technical language, alpha functions, which is basically thinking. Again, what I do in the rest of this paper, and I think I'll probably expand upon this in lecture 2, is say why the thing I'm talking about, or some of the things I'm talking about, do not fit into this model of being an object relation. So in a sense, what I'm using Fanon to do is come up with a different genealogy of thinking in its relationship to its primordial discomforts, which precipitate us into being. And again, one of the ways in which I think you can do this philosophically is to look at the way in which, say, I mean, even psychoanalytically, in ways in which negation, or passive negation, I mean, which is a destructive thing, is not the same thing as a kind of what I'm calling the NAPA, or the is not. And again, I can make this clearer perhaps after we finish this event, because it's kind of complicated. But an example of negation is a classic Woody Allen, Freud, sorry to evoke Woody Allen, but Freud example of "This is not my mother." The crude reading is say, of course it is. But I'm interested in reading the sentence slightly differently. So the is not becomes, for me, a question. A different kind of thinking about this is not is what I'm trying to do. And this is at the heart of, I think, and again, Freud uses this word Aufhebung or Aufheben in this negation paper to talk about this relationship between negation and symbolization. And again, this word Aufheben has a kind of deep philosophical resonance. You could take it in multiple directions, but there is in psychoanalysis the idea that something that is unbearable needs to be translated, transcoded into something else to make it more bearable. It needs to be put into a representation or into a symbolic form. So one of the things I'm struggling with in this paper is a very simple problem. How do you symbolize an absence? An absence which thereby cannot be negated, translated, decoded, recoded, transferred. And I think that's what Fanon is trying to get at. And when he's talking about these acts without precede a kind of, these denials, sorry, which precede kind of guilt or sincerity, or indeed verity, or volition, or indeed representation. That's about the size of it, I think. So we might have a different reading of Bion. We might, I don't know. I'm not saying mine is correct. But I'm trying to use Bion to think something slightly differently. Mm. Mm-hmm. Yes. Yeah. Yeah. I mean, if you exclude somebody from a social contract, so if you say these people are congenitally, phylogenetically predisposed to lie, they can't enter into a social contract in any sense, because the social contract relies on promising relies on a kind of trust and consent and assent and all the rest of it. And these, if you're excluded from that, you're also excluded, I would say, from any kind of ethics or ethical subjectivity. And I think he says that in more than one place. In all of the books, he talks about how the native is excluded from the language and discourse of ethics. And he says that's a consequence of how the wretched, if you like, is being construed by both law and culture in the colony. So how does the wretched respond to that? And one of the things he argues is that because these negations are a consequence of a colonial symbolization of who I am, and I've internalized that, through because of what he calls these structures of imposition, dominance, hegemony, what have you. How do I get rid of it? And in a sense, it's a reverse metabolization. I need to, in a sense, vomit these things out of me. And one of the ways in which the words he uses to talk about that demetabolization or depetrification is this notion of catharsis. And, you know, so, I mean, I don't think it's catharsis simply at a psychological level. I think it's as a way of being. So, and catharsis in this chapter, which I take this quote from, is related to a question of violence. Now, again, it's not an instrumental account of violence. It's basically saying that if your being has been petrified by these kinds of construals, then you need to radically depetrify. And that in itself is a kind of process, a violent demetabolization of that which petrifies you. So, so he's not simply arguing for vengeance or what it means, what could be simply read here as, you know, you simply, whatever hurts them most gives us pleasure, that kind of equation, although that is definitely being implied here. But I think the shift in truth, or the lack of truth, to this is making a very important psychopolitical point. The moment you construe the native as beyond the social contract, beyond ethics, that boomerangs back on the colonizer. They themselves become aberrant via reason and also ethics, because they have recognition from that which is you don't want recognition from. So it cycles out, and it leads to what he calls the absence of truth in the colony. But that's a psychopolitical performance of truth. But then there is something being indicated there that there is a truth, and this comes back to your question, which somehow transcends those oppositions. So what is that kind of truth? That's the big question, I think. I mean, you could, and I think, you know, at that point he's referring to the messianic, transformative, revolutionary moment as that kind of transcendental truth which redeems all forms of immanence, you know, whatever they are, class, race, gender. Yeah. Yeah. Yes. Yes.
Where is, I'm trying to understand where he is.
Yes.
As you say, we don't have the words, the sick, the lumpen, the
yes.
whatever occupies that similar position.
Yes.
Through Fanon's work. We have him put in a position of a certain kind of truth.
Mm-hmm.
What is that?
Mm-hmm.
He's not the North African, and yet claims the pronoun that affiliates him with the fact that he is the colonized, yet he's not. He's put in the position of someone who potentially tells the truth. So I'd love to hear you
on him.
Yes.
The rhetoric of the piece is interesting. So whenever he refers to himself as an expert witness, he talks about his own uneasiness and discomfort as a witness. And again, it's not because I think the locus of this discomfort or unease is not because he sees himself just as an inside outsider or as an outside insider. It's because he's trying to make sense of something which I think challenges is conventional understandings of, going back to your question, the epistemological tropes of truth, confession, sincerity, guilt, and what constitutes the act itself, or the event of. And again, I think there is a moment where he is definitely identifying with these defendants in their resistance to the ways in which judgment is being used to both include and exclude at the same time. But I don't think he's simply substituting an identification as a response to his own sense of unease or discomfort. I think the unease and discomfort is, the way I think about it, it's like it's like a speculative proposition. I keep on saying that, but what I mean by that is very specific. Insofar as what makes a proposition into a speculative one is that it changes both the terms of predication in the process of grasping it. So that would apply to his role as psychiatrist, as witness, but also as fellow traveler politically, I think. And it would also apply to his own masculinity, a whole range of synonyms follow on from that. But again, people perhaps aren't aware that this idea of a thought without a thinker is a very hard thing to think. Yeah. Psychoanalysis tries to do it, but it always ends up at this ineffable moment, this non-place, which has no place. And I try to figure it in terms of these various tropes of non-being or is not, but it's you don't want to convert it into yet simply another form of affirmation. That's will be pointless, or something you can simply turn into a semantic thing we can just trot off. Oh yeah, this is what it means. Right? Because that would be completely contradictory of the entire ambition, which is to hold on to these things without reducing them to what they are not. Does that make sense?
It does.
Oh, good. Okay. Yeah.
Thank you, Steve.
Yeah. Thank you.